From food to commodity, how food systems lose anchorage. In real life, food is always from somewhere. It has always been produced somewhere, and there are always people behind. How can it turn into a commodity? Through what processes? In economics, the term commodity is used to designate basic, essential, and common product, standardized product with perfectly defined qualities known to buyers, in order that products from different suppliers can be easily interchangeable, products available from a significant number of suppliers, and products that can be banked. Wheat, coal, copper are examples of commodities. The goal of this lecture is to continue to reflect on embeddedness and on the idea of food system anchorage by understanding the genesis of food from nowhere regime. Remember from your previous lecture about embedded food system, you got 2 key points. Embedded food systems express a shift from global food from nowhere regime to food from somewhere regime. And embeddedness refers to social and natural anchorage of food system. These 2 points are masterfully illustrated by the story told by William Cronon in his book Nature's Metropolis. Cronon told the story of co-evolution of the western Great Plains, once the Great Bison Grasslands, and the city of Chicago during the second half of the 19th century. In doing so, he showed the genesis of the food from nowhere regime. We will follow 2 main characters in this story. First is grain, wheat and corn mainly. Second is the grain elevator. Grain elevators are these large warehouses, which in fact are more than just warehouses, as we will see. The first part of the story. In the first half of the 19th century, Chicago is strategically located to become the best place for marketing grain. Chicago is connected to waterways through the Mississippi River down to the south and through the Great Lakes route to the eastern coast. Grain travels by boats in individual bags on the back of individual workers. At transfer points, warehouses kept individual lots carefully separated from each other. A farm family sending a load of wheat from Illinois to New York could still have recovered the same wheat packed with a bill of lading inside its original sacks in a Manhattan warehouse several weeks later. Thanks to the bag with the bill with the name of the owner, a connection is maintained between the producer and the buyer throughout the journey. Sacks are structuring the food system. Sack-based shipments means many workers for loading and unloading operations, and these operations are time-consuming. Ownership rights to grain remain with its original shipper until it reached the final point of sale. The farmer or storekeeper who sold grain to a Chicago merchant continued to own it as it traveled hundreds of miles to New Orleans or New York. This meant that the shipper bore all the risk for damage that might occur during transit. And it made sense not to break up individual shipments or mix them with others because shippers and their customers wanted to know exactly what they were selling and buying. When distant urban millers decided to buy the grain, they did so after examining a representative sample. Buyers are offering a price based on their judgment of the quality of this sample. Sack-based shipment keeps traces of the production conditions throughout the trip until the final buyer. Sack-based shipment define grain as food from somewhere. Grain is marketed as a product of a particular tract of land and a particular farmer's labor. In the second half of the century, major changes in Chicago market are caused by the invention and soon the multiplication of steam-powered grain elevator. These large warehouses are equipped with automatic mechanism, steam-powered conveyors that allow to handle large quantities of grain in continuously moving streams. Elevators transform grain produced on farm in the West Great Plains into a golden stream. In fact, to move up conveyors belts, grain has to be sackless. The development of the railroad to the west and north allowed the new farm settlements that turned the prairie over, producing more grain. Railroad cars moved quantities of grain more quickly than ships. It had become complicated and costly for elevator operators to keep small quantities of different owners' grain in separate bins, and that were only partially filled. They started to mix grain in common bins. Crops from dozens of different farms could then mingle. Mixing shipments created a problem of quality. Farmers started to complain that prices did not adequately reflect differences in quality among different shipments. A new organization, the Chicago Board of Trade, solved the problem. The board imposed formal grading regulations and appointed grain inspectors. The key step was to make formal distinctions between grains of different quality. The board no longer recognized spring wheat as a single category, but instead broke it into 4 grades ranked from high quality to low: Club Spring, Number 1 Spring, Number 2 Spring, and Rejected. Grain is now marketed as a product of a specific quality, but has become food from nowhere. Elevators detach the grain from the social and ecological conditions of its production. Elevators redesigned the food system. New communication technology, the telegraph, made the Chicago Board of Trade one of the key grain markets in the world by the late 1850s. When the Board of Trade adopted the standard grading system, it made grain interchangeable, not just between elevator bins, but between cities and the continents as well. Once people outside Chicago began to know and trust the board's grading system, a grain dealer in New York could buy, for example, Chicago Number 2 Spring wheat on the basis of prices quoted over the telegraph lines. No longer it was necessary to see a sample. A New Yorker could simply check telegraph quotations and send back an order when the price seems right. Thanks to fluid information about price, people started to speculate, that is to say, to gamble on future price increases and decreases, creating what is called futures markets. Elevator receipts were bought and sold without any grain moving out of any elevator. The transaction could be repeated dozens of times without any wheat or corn moving out of any elevator. Grain came out physical market. The price of grain became partially disconnected from grain production. Elevators' receipt as trade on the floor of change transmuted grain into gold or dollars. The Chicago Tribune estimated that the city's grain business is about $200 million, when at the same time the elevator receipt business was 10 times greater. On this new market, grain turned to be a commodity. Grain from anywhere in the world is interchangeable. Grain can be banked and one can speculate on it. And most important, only price matters. What did we learn from this story? We can think of a new definition of embedded food systems as systems where products keep traces of the history of their production, both ecological history and social history. We learned the importance of technical devices acting in the system. Food systems must be considered as social technical networks where human and non-human actors, artifacts, and nature play a role. They play part in ensuring the system or losing anchorage, in contributing to system locks-in defining the quality of the product.